Chapter 4. We come from Oriel. The same council chamber of the military district court which had condemned Janssen had also condemned to death a peasant of the government of Oriel, of the district of Yeltsin, Mikhail Gublets, who nicknamed Tizignov, also Tatarin. His latest crime, proven beyond question, had been the murder of 3 people, an armed robbery. Behind that, his dark past disappeared in a depth of mystery. There were vague rumors that he had participated in a series of other murders and robberies, and his path there was felt to be a dark trail of blood, fire, and drunken debauchery. He called himself a murderer with utter frankness and sincerity, and scornfully regarded those who, according to the latest fashion, styled themselves expropriators. Of his last crime, since it was useless for him to deny anything, he spoke freely and in detail, but in answer to questions about his past, he merely gritted his teeth, whistled, and said, "Search for the wind of the fields." When he was annoyed in cross-examination, Ziagnov assumed a serious and dignified air. "All of us from Oriel are thoroughbreds," he would say gravely and deliberately. "Oriel and Kroma are homes of first-class thieves. Karachev and Livna are the breeding place of thieves, and Yeltsin is the parent of all thieves. Now, well, what else is there to say?" He was nicknamed Tizignov, Gypsy, because of his appearance and his thievish manner. He was black-haired, lean, with yellow spots on his prominent Tartar-like cheekbones. His glance was swift, brief, but fearfully direct and searching, and the thing upon which he looked for a moment seemed to lose something, seemed to deliver up to him a part of itself, and to become something else. It was just as unpleasant and repugnant to take a cigarette at which he looked, as though it had already been in his mouth. There was a certain constant restlessness in him, now twisting him like a rag, now throwing him about like a body of coiling live wires, and he drank water almost by the bucket. To all questions during the trial he answered shortly, firmly, jumping up quickly, and at times he seemed to answer even with pleasure. "Correct," he would say. Sometimes he emphasized it. "Correct." One time, suddenly, when they were speaking of something that would hardly have seemed to suggest it, he jumped to his feet and asked the presiding judge, "Will you allow me to whistle?" "What for?" asked the judge, surprised. "They say that I gave the signal to my comrades. I would like to show you how. It is very interesting." The judge consented, and somewhat wonderingly. Ziagnov quickly placed 4 fingers in his mouth, 2 fingers of each hand, rolled his eyes fiercely, and then the dead of air of the courtroom was suddenly rent by a real, wild, murderer's whistle, at which frightened horses leapt and rear on their hind legs, and human faces involuntarily blanch. The mortal anguish of him who is to be assassinated, the wild joy of the murderer, the dreadful warning, the call, the gloom and loneliness of stormy autumn night, all this rang in his piercing shriek, which was neither human nor beastly. The presiding officer shouted, then waved his arm to Ziagnov, and Ziagnov obediently became silent, and, like an artist who had triumphantly performed a difficult aria, he sat down, wiped his wet fingers upon his coat, and surveyed those present with an air of satisfaction. "What a robber," said one of the judges, rubbing his ear. Another one, however, with a wild Russian beard, but with eyes like a Tartar, like those of Tizignov, gazed pensively above Ziagnov's head, then smiled and remarked, "It is indeed interesting." With light hearts, without mercy, without the slightest pangs of conscience, the judges brought out against Ziagnov a verdict of death. "Correct," said Ziagnov when the verdict was pronounced. In the open field, on the crossbeam. Correct." And turning to the convoy, he hurled with bravado, "Well, are we not going? Come on, you sour coat, and hold your gun. I might take it away from you." The soldier looked at him sternly, with fear, exchanged glances with his comrade, and felt the lock of his gun. The other did the same, and all the way to the prison the soldiers felt that they were not walking, but flying through the air, as if hypnotized by the prisoner. They felt neither the ground beneath their feet, nor the passage of time, nor themselves. Mishka Mishka Gyaznov, like Yanskom, had to spend 17 days in prison before his execution, and all 17 days passed as though they were one day. They were bound up in one inextinguishable thought of escape, of freedom, of life. The restlessness of Sagnov, which was now repressed by the walls and the bars of the dead window through which nothing could be seen, turned all its fury upon himself, and burned his soul like coal scattered upon boards. As though he were in a drunken vapor, bright but incomplete images swarmed upon him, failing and then becoming confused, and then rushing again through his mind in an unrestrainable, blinding whirlwind. And all were bent towards escape, towards liberty, towards life. With his nostrils expanded, like those of a horse, Sagnov smelt the air for hours long. It seemed to him that he could smell the odor of hemp, of the smoke of fire, the colorless and biting smell of burning. Now he whirled about in the room like a top, touching the walls, tapping them nervously with his fingers from time to time, taking aim, boring the ceiling with his gaze, filing the prison bars. By his restlessness, he had tired out the soldiers who watched him through the little window, and who, several times, in despair, had threatened to shoot. Sagnov would retort coarsely and derisively, and the quarrel would end peacefully, because the dispute would soon turn into boorish, unoffending abuse, after which shooting would have seemed absurd and impossible. Sagnov slept during the nights soundly, without stirring, in unchanging yet live motionlessness, like a wire spring in temporary inactivity. But as soon as he rose, he immediately commenced to walk, to plan, to grope about. His hands were always dry and hot, but his heart at times would suddenly grow cold, as if a cake of unmelting ice had been placed upon his chest, sending a slight dry shiver through his whole body. At such times, Sagnov, always dark in complexion, would turn black, assuming the shade of bluish cast iron, and he acquired a curious habit. As though he had eaten too much of something sickeningly sweet, he kept licking his lips, smacking them, and would spit on the floor hissingly through his teeth. When he spoke, he did not finish his words, so rapidly did his thoughts run that his tongue was unable to compass them.